this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to take a look and read of this gorgeous vintage book. It's about the Bayeux Tapestry, the Norman Conquest, 1066. It's by Norman Denny and Josephine Filmer Sankey. And you can see part of the Bayeux Tapestry actually on the front cover, and also there is William the Conqueror on the back. So it starts with a lovely map inside, and you can see England at the top. This is the English Channel, and then Normandy on the other side of the channel. Mont Saint-Michel, that's Bayeux. Rouen, Hastings is up here. So the book is full of illustrations of the Bayeux Tapestry, and also there is an explanation about what the different parts of the tapestry indicate. Now, let me see. So the book was originally published in 1966, and this is a reprint from 1984. So I think we're going to start by reading the introduction, and that'll give you a bit of a background, I think, into what the Bayeux Tapestry actually is. The Bayeux Tapestry is a very old version of what we are apt to think of as a modern thing. It is a strip cartoon, one of the earliest and certainly the greatest that is known to us, and it was made strip of linen is about 230 feet long and 20 inches wide. It was made in 8 sections, afterwards stitched together, probably embroidered by separate teams of craftsmen or women. Nothing is now known of these people, but at the time when the work was carried out, probably between AD 1070 and 1080, there was a school of embroidery at Canterbury in Kent, which was famous throughout Europe for needlework of this kind. We cannot be sure, but it looks as though this is where the work was done. In short, although the tapestry is Norman in origin and represents the Norman point of view, it was probably executed by English hands. After its completion, the tapestry was taken to Bayeux Cathedral, where it was preserved among the church's greatest treasures, being hung round the nave on feast days and special occasions. There it remained for 7 centuries, untroubled, meticulously cared for, and, it would seem, largely disregarded by the scholars and historians who might have been expected to take more interest in something that was at once a great work of art, a wonderful story, and a unique historical document. Then more notice was taken of it, and its life became more adventurous. It narrowly escaped destruction in the early days of the French Revolution, and later was taken to Paris to be exhibited there by order of Napoleon, who was planning another invasion of England at the time. During the next 100 years or so, it underwent many vicissitudes and changed its dwelling many times, suffering considerable damage in the process. But in 1945 it was placed on exhibition in the former palace of the bishops of Bayeux, next to Bayeux Cathedral. Then, in 1983, it was again moved. After examination and meticulous restoration, it was installed in a splendid new home, the sumptuously converted Centre Guillaume-le-Conquérant in the old seminary. Unlike the modern strip cartoon, the tapestry has no conversation and does not make use of those interesting bubbles saying "thinks." The Latin inscription gives us some indication of what is going on, but for the most part the pictures are left to speak for themselves. There are many gaps, and many of the details are so puzzling that learned men have been disputing over them for the past 100 years, and will no doubt continue to do so. The tapestry does not explain. Sometimes it seems to contradict itself, and sometimes, as we know from other historical records, it gets things wrong. In writing about it, we have adopted a particular plan. The first paragraph on every page, whether on 2 paragraphs, as there generally are, simply describes what is happening. By reading these first paragraphs alone, you will be able to follow the story as the tapestry tells it. But where necessary, we have added a second paragraph in smaller type, often much longer, in which we look more closely at the picture and discuss some of the details. We try to explain things more fully, to it says, one very small scene has been omitted from this account of the Bayeux Tapestry. It contains two figures, those of a woman called Ethelgiva and a monk. Its meaning and significance are lost to us. There is a theory that it has to do with William's offer of his daughter in marriage to Harold, but this is unsupported by any evidence. In short, the scene is a puzzle for scholars, and since it contributes nothing to the story except a moment of confusion, we have felt justified in leaving it out. Okay. So here we have the story begins. It seems certain that some years before this opening scene, Edward, who was childless, had promised Duke William of Normandy that he should succeed him on the throne of England. Possibly Harold was sent to confirm this promise, but it may be that he went of his own accord to gain the friendship of William, for these two were renowned warriors, great and powerful men. The year was probably 1064. There are certain things we must remember about the tapestry. First, that it is a tale founded on rumour and report, the tales men told at the time, which must often have been altered in the telling. Much of the truth is now lost to us, and secondly, it is a Norman tale, told, that is to say, from the Norman point of view and pointing a moral, as we shall see as the story progresses. So, the story begins in the royal palace of Westminster. Edward the Confessor, the King of England, is talking to Harold, Earl of Wessex, his wife's brother. He sends Harold on a mission to Normandy in France. Edward Rex, King. Harold leaves for the coast with a hawk on his wrist, a pack of hounds and men-at-arms following behind. Harold and his men enter the church at Bosham on the Sussex coast to pray for a safe voyage. Then they go to one of Harold's many homes, the manor house at Bosham, where they feast and make merry until a servant hurries up the stairs to tell them that all is in readiness for their departure. They would have had to hurry off, taking advantage of wind and tide. So the hawk and hounds indicate that Harold was engaged upon a mission of peace, and the hawk was also a token of nobility. At the right of the picture we see the first of the trees, which appear at intervals throughout the tapestry, both as a decoration and to separate certain of the scenes. Here it is. Trees figured frequently in the decorative designs of the period, but these may also point to the Norman origin of the tapestry. The Normans, although they had settled in France, were Norsemen, men from the north, and the tree is part of Nordic mythology. Yggdrasil, the tree of life. of stairs leading to the great hall, nor does the tapestry take account of time. Boats sailed with difficulty in those days. They may have had to wait many days for a fair wind. Next section. Stripping off the woolen hose, they wade out to the boat, which men hold with poles to prevent the tide from leaving it stranded. Harold goes first, still carrying his hawk. A man in the boat is setting up the mast. The borders of this image contain beasts, both real and imaginary. Scraps of old fables, scenes of country life. For the most part they are only a decoration, but now and then the story flows over into them, and sometimes they make their own contribution to it. Next picture. The ships sail across the English Channel, packed with Harold's escort of armed men, whose shields are arranged along the sides. The ship behind is steered by Harold, himself with the kind of rudder they used in those days, which was like an oar. In the ship in front, a lookout has climbed to the masthead. A man is sounding with the lead, and another is making ready the anchor as they approach land. These are ships similar to those in which the Vikings sailed. The tapestry is much nearer to truth in its ships than in its buildings. The Vikings were accustomed to slinging their shields along the sides of the vessel when it was under sail and the oars were not in use. Next picture. The English land, and Harold is taken prisoner by Count Guy de Ponto, a vassal of Duke William, who rides down to the seashore, leading a force of mounted men. Harold is defending himself with his sax, a weapon which was both a dagger and a knife, used for eating as well as fighting. Tales differ as to this landfall. The tapestry shows the English wading calmly and peaceably ashore. But many historians believe that they were shipwrecked or at least driven ashore by adverse winds. The place was near Saint-Valery, at the mouth of the River Somme, in Guy de Ponto's domain. It is unlikely that Harold would have wished to land there, since Count Guy was unfriendly towards him, as the story shows. They ride must pay to be released from captivity. On the right, an Englishman is listening to their talk, peeping cautiously round a column. It was the age of chivalry, when good manners and brutality went hand in hand. A nobleman who became the prisoner of another nobleman was commonly held to ransom, but Harold is treated with the respect due to a great lord. He rides in front, disarmed but still carrying his hawk. As a rule, the Normans can be distinguished from the English in the tapestry by the fact that they are clean-shaven, with the backs of their heads shaved in the Norman style, whereas the English are shown with a full beard of hair and a moustache, but sometimes the tapestry forgets about this. The scene is filled with drama. The group of retainers on the left, both English and Norman, anxiously await the outcome of the bargaining. Harold's sword has been returned to him, which suggests that the negotiations are going well. He is being treated with honour. A soldier touches Count Guy's arm to draw his attention to the approach of someone from outside. The Englishman by the pillar peers and listens, and perhaps it is he who escaped from the castle to bring Duke William news of what has happened. We must remember that the tapestry plays tricks with time. All these things, which may have taken days or weeks, are packed into one scene. Next section. Messengers arrive from Count Guy's overlord, Duke William of Normandy. Count Guy receives them with his battle-axe in his hand, while a dwarf holds their panting horses. They have come to demand the surrender of Harold, and they are followed by armed riders sent by the great Duke to escort the English nobleman to his castle. The second of the messengers, it seems, was called Thorold. We know he was a person of importance. Count Guy, if we may judge by his attitude and his battle-axe, was not pleased at receiving this order, but it was one that he was bound to obey. The building is another representation of his castle. The dragons on the riders' shields were an emblem common to both Norman and English. And here, Harold and William ride together to Rouen, Harold going in front, in the place of honour. A watchman hails them from the tower of the castle as they approach. Then, in the great hall, William sits listening, while Harold addresses him. It may be that he is delivering a message from King Edward. The picture makes it clear that this was a formal interview of great importance. Harold, who is weaponless, speaks with eloquent gestures, while William listens intently, clasping his sword. But the two men must have had many chose to treat him as such. Whether Harold was there as Edward's ambassador or whether he had come solely on his own account, or both, there was much for them to discuss. Above all, the future of England and Normandy, and the part each was to play in the affairs of their respective countries after Edward's death. We have no record of what passed between them. All that can be said with certainty is that in the course of this visit, which seems to have lasted for at least a year, Duke William of Normandy and the Earl of Wessex became firm friends for a time. Next section. Duke William leads his army against Duke Conan of Brittany, who has declared war on him. William, carrying a mace, a battle club, and symbol of authority, rides with 2 knights in armour and other mounted men, but he himself wears only a quilted tunic and no helmet. Harold accompanies the expedition. The army crosses the river Couesnon between Normandy and Brittany, passing near Mont Saint-Michel, St. Michael's Mount, which is to be seen in the background. Here, Harold performs a feat of great valour. He rescues 2 soldiers from the quicksands at the river's edge and carries them safely ashore. That they should have gone campaigning together is clear evidence of the friendship between William and Harold. Here, for the first time in the tapestry, we see a gonfanon, the square battle pennant with 3 points attached to the lance of one of the knights. These pennants were of Nordic origin, another reminder that the Normans were men from the north. And here we see the war against Brittany. The Normans attack the castle of Dol, and Duke Conan escapes by sliding down a rope. Going in pursuit of him and his army, the Normans pass by the town of Rennes, which we see in the background with its Latin name, Redness. Here the tapestry is in error. Duke Conan was not in the castle of Dol when it was besieged. The truth is that he was besieging it, since the Breton lord who held it by feudal right under Conan had allied himself to William and risen against his overlord. The Norman army went to the relief of the castle, and having driven off Conan's army, pursued past Rennes. The castle of Dol was one of the motte and bailey kind, a fortress built on a hill, the motte, with rings of outer defences, consisting principally of earthworks. The open spaces between these outer rings, where troops could manoeuvre, were known as the baileys. Since Dol is shown as having a drawbridge, it must also have had a moat. The artist has decorated the 2 hills, those of Dol and Rennes, with pictures of birds and beasts. fiercely assailed by the Normans, and they set fire to the castle. We see him offering the keys of the town to Duke William on the end of a lance, in token of surrender. A complicated scene in which there is much action. The tapestry shows us the castle of Dinan in a double sense. On the one side it is being attacked, and on the other side it is capitulating. The setting fire to the castle is a separate scene in itself. It is carried out by two armoured knights, each of whom has put down his shield and thrust his lance with its gonfanon into the ground, since the work was done by knights and not by ordinary soldiers. It was evidently a feat calling for great skill and daring. And here William gives arms to Harold. That is to say, he does him honour for the gallant part he has played in the fighting. Then they ride to the castle of Bayeux. The giving of arms was an important matter. William was conferring a high honour on Harold, just as in the present day a man who has done his country a distinguished service may be made a Knight of the Garter, or awarded the Order of Merit or the Congressional Medal of Honour. But in the feudal age it had a double meaning, for if it conferred dignity and privilege, it also required something in return, allegiance. We see the significance of this in the scene that follows. So, here, Harold swears allegiance to William. Standing with his hands upon an altar and a chest containing sacred relics, they are believed to have come from the cathedral at Bayeux, he utters a solemn vow that he will be William's man, and serve and obey him in everything. The gravity of the occasion is manifest in every detail of the scene. William sits on his ceremonial chair, sword in hand, extending one hand with a pointing finger as though to say, "Swear," and the gesture is reflected by the man standing on Harold's other side. This solemn moment is the turning point of the story, and it depicts an event of great significance in the history of Western Europe. That Harold swore an oath of allegiance to William is not in doubt. It implied, among many other things, that he would not accept the throne of England without William's consent. Did he swear willingly? That is the question. The tapestry, of Norman origin, we must remember, would have us believe that he did, that this was a free oath, freely taken, arising out of the friendship between the two men. But Harold was in William's hands. William could hold him captive and threaten him with death if he did not swear. And in this scene, Harold returns to feasting and carousing in friendly company with William must have reached King Edward's ears. The news can hardly have pleased the king, because he badly needed Harold in England. The situation had changed in the past year, and Edward may well have realised that any promise he had given William of succession to the English throne could no longer be fulfilled without bloodshed. Harold's attitude as he crosses the cobbled yard of the palace is that of a man preparing a speech in his defence. We do not know if he told Edward of his oath of allegiance to William. So, I'm going to leave it there, and next we'll continue with a story. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers saying, I shall see you very soon. Bye bye for now. Bye bye. Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to do the second part of this lovely vintage book about the Bayeux Tapestry, the Norman Conquest, 1066. If you missed the first part, I'll put the link in the description of the video. So, let's begin. So this is where we were up to. The tapestry here moves from right to left. We do not know why. The artist may have felt that he achieved a more dramatic and moving composition in this way, and perhaps he wished to lay stress upon the splendid new church, which Edward himself had built, and which was destined to outlive so many kings. There is a great wealth of detail. The picture of Westminster Abbey, as we now call it, is the only one in the tapestry where an attempt has been made to depict the real appearance of a building. We see a man fixing the weathercock, an indication of the fact that work on the building was still not complete. But the hand of God, pointing down from heaven, shows that it has been consecrated. In fact, the ceremony of consecration was performed exactly a week before Edward's death, on the 5th of January, 1066. The tapestry depicts his funeral pyre with great care and reverence. Another year has passed and King Edward the Confessor is dead. We see him above lying on his deathbed in an upper room of his palace of Westminster, speaking his last words to Queen Edith, his wife, while a priest and an attendant minister to him. He is laid in state in the great hall below, and then is borne in a solemn funeral procession to the newly built church of St. Peter, which later became the Abbey of Westminster. Harold is offered the crown of England in succession to Edward the Confessor. He stands, axe in hand, looking at the crown, and perhaps wondering if he should accept. He does accept, and in so doing breaks his solemn oath to William of Normandy. We see him seated on the throne, crowned and holding the orb and sceptre. rests none. Harold was not only forsworn, he had betrayed his friend. That is the grim story, as the tapestry tells it. Moreover, Harold's acceptance of the crown incurred the wrath of the church for another reason. Archbishop Stigand, who proclaimed him to the people, and may possibly have performed the ceremony of coronation, of this we cannot be sure, had been excommunicated by the Pope, and therefore was not entitled to hold the office of Archbishop. Such was the case which caused powerful forces to be arrayed against Harold, whose defence was that he had taken the oath under duress, being in William's power, and that therefore it was not valid. A strange star appears in the sky. A comet with a fiery tail, and the people gaze at it in terror. An astrologer tells Harold that this is an omen of misfortune. In the border below this scene, we see the ghastly outlines of ships stealing across the sea. Perhaps this was Harold's dream as he lay troubled by the thought of the oath he had broken, and to the doom which might follow the breaking of his oath. So, of course, this star in the sky was Halley's Comet, which can be seen from the Earth at intervals of about 75 years. It would have been clearly visible in the English sky in February of that year, 1066. And we also saw it in 1984. In this scene, a boat sails from England with messengers bringing William's news of Harold's coronation. The scene is bordered by a tree on either side. Two Nordic trees of life, as though to stress the momentousness and gravity of this secret mission. The messengers may have been Norman or English, for there were powerful men in England who were hostile to Harold. Opposite, William holds a council of war. He has been robbed of the English crown by Harold, and he resolves instantly to seize it by force of arms and to exact retribution for Harold's betrayal. He gives orders for a fleet of ships to be built to carry his army across the Channel, and men at once set to work felling trees for their timbers. William is seated at the council of war with his hand on his hip, and beside him is Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William's half-brother and principal adviser. It was he who later ordered the making of the tapestry. We are not to suppose that William's decision to invade England was taken as quickly as the picture suggests. Ambassadors were sent to England to remind Harold of his oath and calling upon him to surrender the crown to William. Harold refused. If William believed that Harold had betrayed him, Harold believed no less sincerely that his oath, taken most done was probably Dives-sur-Mer, on the Normandy coast, not far from the town of Caen. The building of this great armada within a few months was in itself a very remarkable feat. Some 800 vessels must have been needed to transport William's powerful and well-equipped army. Opposite the loading of the ships, arms and supplies are being carried on board. Hauberks, or suits of mail, spears, swords, helmets, barrels of wine and water, and sacks of flour. While this great work of preparation was going on in Normandy, Harold was no less busy in England, raising and preparing a fleet and army of his own to meet the coming invasion. And for both commanders, the same problem arose, that of keeping their forces together. Both were dependent to a large extent, although not wholly, upon feudal levies, serfs and villains bound by feudal law to give armed service to their lords. But the lords were strict and clear. The men were only obliged to serve for a limited time. Moreover, they were peasants, men with fields to till and families to support. They were likely to grow restless and even mutinous if they were not allowed to go home for the harvest. In this image, William leads a party of his knights down to the foreshore to embark in the ships. William has accomplished another remarkable feat. This was the first time in Western Europe that an invading army had taken its horses with it. The earlier invaders of England, Picts, Scots, Angles, Saxons and Romans, had landed on foot and scoured the countryside for horses, but William's armoured knights needed chargers specially bred and trained to carry them. This body of knights constituted the most formidable part of William's army, one that the English did not possess. Altogether, the force may have amounted to as many as 2,000 knights, but by no means all of these were Normans. William could call upon the services of some 800 knights in his dukedom of Normandy. The rest were from other countries, adventurers for the most part, who had been induced to join him by the promise of rich rewards when England was conquered. His foot soldiers, including many trained archers, may have amounted to another 4,000 men. It was a great and powerful army for those days, although not as numerous, and in certain respects not as well trained as the force which Harold was capable of raising. Here we see the invasion fleet crossing the English Channel, sailing from Saint-Valery to Pevensey. The ship's tight packed with men and horses. William's ship is towards the front. With a signal lantern at its masthead, and on its stern post a carving of William's son Robert, blowing a horn and carrying a spear with a gonfanon. William sailed from Saint-Valery at the end of September, having moved his armada from Dives 2 or 3 weeks earlier. The wind played a great part in these events, frustrating both commanders. Harold had assembled a powerful fleet off the Isle of Wight, with which he planned to attack pans on spits. Next is a baker standing by his oven and using a large pair of tongs to transfer the cooked loaves or cakes to a trencher. The food is then taken indoors and passed along to a serving table made of shields laid over trestles. Behind this table is a man blowing a horn to announce that the meal is ready. William and his nobles are seated at the festive board. It was probably a round table, but its shape has been altered so as to fit in the figure of the serving man bearing a great dish in the foreground. The central figure at the table is Bishop Odo, who seems to be blessing the feast, although no one is paying much attention to him except William, seated on the right. 3 of the noble lords have already started their meal, and a 4th is apparently drawing their attention to something. On the right of the picture, William is conferring with 2 of his leading advisors, Bishop Odo on his right, and Robert Mortain, who was also his half-brother. Orders have been given for a fortress to be built, and we see this on the right of the picture. It was probably a wooden stockade on a mound surrounded by a deep ditch with a number of watchtowers where lookouts and archers could be posted. The workers all appear to be Normans, although one might have expected English peasants to be rounded up to do the digging and carrying. The Normans, for the most part, are working hard under the supervision of their officers, but discipline seems to have been a little lax, since 2 of the men are fighting. This was probably an important episode at the time, but we do not know what it was about. On the left of the picture is William receiving an urgent report from one of the scouts who have been sent out to keep watch for Harold. Then we see the Normans burning a house and forcing a mother and child to flee from their home. Next comes a tall building which represents the town of Hastings, with its great door open for the Normans to sally forth. Lastly, on the opposite page, we see William making ready to lead his army into battle. A groom brings up his charger. This series of short scenes is like a quick sequence on a cinema film. The designer of the tapestry, who was above all things a storyteller, is building up the suspense before the grand battle piece which is to follow. William on the left is for the first time holding the papal banner with its 4 points. This had been consecrated and sent to him by Pope Alexander II, and it is inserted here to show that the expedition had the blessing of the Church. Nothing is now known about the burning of the house, which again may have been an incident of special importance at the time. In this image, William writes out the head of the knights, the shock troops that were the most powerful part of his army. to battle. William, with his mace, is evidently exhorting his followers to fight bravely. No doubt he will have reminded them that the blessing of the church was upon their enterprise, but since many of them were adventurers in search of gain, small landowners from the countries adjoining Normandy who hoped to add to their estates, his pointing finger may well have been directed also to the rich and fertile English countryside where so much wealth and honour was to be won. The battle has been joined in the centre of the picture, on the ridge of high ground, which was afterwards given the name of battle. We see Harold's housecarls grouped tightly together in a shield wall to resist the onslaught of the Norman cavalry. This shield wall was a fighting formation in which the housecarls were specially trained, and in the centre of the group is a single unarmed bowman, perhaps put in as a reminder that Harold's army contained only a few archers. The bow had not been adopted as a weapon of war in England at that time, and the light arrows used for hunting could have had little effect against armoured knights. Scenes of battle. The fighting went on throughout the day, and the makers of the tapestry have here handed down to us a terrible and wonderful picture of the savagery and confusion of war. The details do not greatly matter. The two armoured figures so dramatically falling in the early part of the picture are Harold's brothers, Lefwin and Gurth. The English housecarls are shown using the Danish battle-axe, a weapon that had been adopted in England, but which was not used by the Normans. We see the slaughter of horses and a stand by a group of English foot soldiers on a hillock. But it is the figure and movement of this battle sequence that makes it remarkable, and the lower border lays further stress on the designer's intention, which was to depict the horror of war. The tapestry does not attempt to give an exact account of the battle, which lasted for 8 hours and developed several stages. Harold, after occupying the ridge, had intended to advance and attack William's army before it was fully deployed, but when he found that William, anticipating this move, had come out sooner than he had expected, he resolved to fight a defensive battle. William at first held back his knights and attacked with his foot soldiers, who were several times repelled with much slaughter. There was a point when the battle hung in the balance. The Norman left wing, consisting mostly of men from Brittany, had crumpled. If the English had stayed where they were and held their ground, they might have gained the day, but a part of Harold's undisciplined force, armed with axes and billhooks and scythes, broke out of the line against his orders and pursued the fleeing Normans. They were cut off and destroyed. At one moment, a rumour swept through the Norman army that William had been wounded. We see him amid the cluster of horsemen on the left of the picture, raising his helmet to show his face and prove that he is unarmed. Immediately in front of him rides a knight carrying the papal banner. The figure with the mace face on the left of the picture is Bishop Odo, rallying the younger horsemen, not all of whom were fully fledged knights. Since the tapestry was being made at Odo's instructions, it was no doubt considered polite to mention him whenever possible. The death of Harold. We see him in the lower picture being struck by a rider with a sword. And since the Latin inscription immediately above him says, "Harold the King is killed," there can be no doubt as to the falling figure is meant to be. Here there is a great question mark. Many history books say that Harold was killed not by a blow with a sword, but by an arrow that pierced his eye. This story, whether it is true or not, is among the most widely believed in all the history of the English people. Yet there are good grounds for supposing that the story is not true and was in fact based at a later date on a misreading of the tapestry. Not until the 12th century, long after the event, do we hear any mention of the arrow. There are two Englishmen depicted in the group, one at either end of the horse. The one on the left is plucking an arrow from his eye, while the one on the right is falling beneath the sword. It must be said that the left-hand figure looks by far the nobler of the two. It seems to have been assumed, and we would like to think it so, that both figures represent Harold, who after plucking out the arrow continued his heroic but unavailing struggle until he was eventually struck down. But there is no other case in the tapestry in which two figures representing the same person are included in one small group, nor would this have conformed to the general custom. It seems likely that if this is what the designer intended, he would have found some way of making his intention clear. We do not know. All this was 9 centuries ago, and the truth of the matter is lost in time. We see the last stages of the battle, the Normans riding on in triumph, and beyond the tree, the English, those that were left, scattering over the countryside to return to their cottages and fields. The Latin inscription following the death of Harold simply says, "And the English turned and fled." There is no more to say. The Norman invasion had succeeded, and Duke William was master of the English realm. There is reason to suppose that the original tapestry did not end quite so abruptly, and that its concluding scenes may have been lost. It seems likely indeed that it would have been concluded in a more solemn and splendid manner, perhaps with the crowning of William at Westminster, and perhaps also something would have been done to point the moral of the story as the Normans tell it, the tragic doom that befell a great and gallant warrior who broke his sacred oath. Another thing that may strike us, surveying the story as a whole, is the part that chance played in the business. Above all, the chance of weather. If the wind had favoured William as soon as his force was assembled, he would undoubtedly have taken advantage of it to set sail. Perhaps 6 weeks earlier than he did. In that event, he would have encountered Harold's full force, both by sea and by land, and would in all likelihood have been defeated. There would have been no Norman conquest of England, and the history of the English people would have been profoundly changed, whether for better or for worse, no one can say. And that